Old Testament, we kind of get angry. Not angry, but very straight to the point. Over the past couple of weeks, we've been talking about the animosity between Sarah and Hagar inside of Abraham's home. Well, it continues. We finished out last week with Sarah saying, Abraham, you've got to cast Hagar and Ishmael out. Anybody remember why? Good, I'm glad you didn't. It gives me more time to talk. That's fine. What happened was she saw somewhere between the age of, if Isaac was weaned at this time, he would have been 3 years old, given the time and customs that they weaned children off back in their day. He would have been about 3 years old, so about 3 to 4. Well, for 13 years, God didn't talk to Abraham, and we know that God stopped talking to Abraham when Ishmael was born. So Ishmael's probably 16 or 17 years old during this time, and Sarah catches Ishmael taunting Isaac. So it makes her mad. Not including the fact that all the other things that she had dealt with for all them years for the bad decisions in which she helped make inside the home for the last 13 years, they're still dealing with. So she goes to her husband and tells Abraham, you've got to get rid of... Sarah tells Abraham, you've got to get rid of Hagar. Hagar has got to go. Now, in my mind, if the animosity has been going on inside of this home for this amount of time, getting rid of Hagar is probably not that big of a deal. But it's a huge deal to get rid of one of your children. If I went to Amanda and said, hey, we've got to get rid of one of our kids, it's probably not going to be a very good conversation between me and her, okay? It's not going to be pretty. Well, here Sarah is telling her husband, you've got to get rid of our stepson, basically. And immediately, Abraham starts to grieve because he knows or he believes that keeping Ishmael close to him, he can raise Ishmael in such a way that he'll be appeasing unto the Lord, and he will be a man of God, and he will show up, and he will do the things in which God told him to do. That's what will happen. In his mind, that's what he's got settled is going to occur. Okay, so when Sarah goes to him and tells him, hey, you know what? Ishmael's got to go. Well, now what has been animosity inside of the home for these last 13 years or 14 years or so has just got worse. I said last week that 13 years inside of a house with a woman and a woman fighting will drive a man to suicide. So here Abraham is he's been inside the home with Hagar and Sarah fighting and bickering back and forth, blah, 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 blah. He's done gone crazy. So he goes to God and starts having a conversation with God because God's been quiet for the last 13 years. And God starts to speak to him again and said, okay, well, let's do this thing over. I told you were going to have a child with your wife, and a year from now it's going to happen. So then he didn't tell him how long the first go-round, but the second go-round he says, within a year to the day of today, you will have a son, and his name will be Isaac. Okay, so the promise has been born, the promise has been weaned, so he's about 3 years old. So we've got a 17-year-old boy and a 3-year-old boy. We've got a 17-year-old man's way and a 3-year-old God's way. Sounds about like our life sometimes. 17 years, we did it all wrong. But for the last 3 years, God's been doing it right in our lives, and then things are starting to come to the way they should have been from the beginning. Amen. Well, if you study this thing out, where'd Hagar come from? Egypt. We know she's an Egyptian. But when did she arrive? If you back up and go to chapter number 16, you'll find a story where Abraham is going into Egypt and tells his wife Sarah, don't tell them you're my wife. Because if you do, they're going to kill me. Well, when the Pharaoh and them gave Abraham stuff just to leave, Hagar was in that stuff. But she's not named during that time. Because when you would give cattle and stuff like that, you would give servants to take care of them. She's an Egyptian girl. She would have been raised by the Egyptians in the Egyptian ways, and then she came to Abraham, and here she finds herself. And obviously, Sarah is good looking because the Pharaoh's son immediately seen Sarah and wanted Sarah. So he gives Abraham something that's probably comparable to Sarah. He probably don't give her a handmaiden that's ugly, because he would have had to appease Abraham to leave. So I'm thinking to myself that he's got two women inside of his home that are good-looking women, and they're fighting and causing him a lot of grief. So the grievousness that he's having during this time in 21:11 is not between him and his wives. It's between him and the fact he's got to let one of his sons go. Okay? I was searching through Facebook this way when I seen Justin kissing John Boy, thinking to himself, well, John Boy didn't like it to start with, and two, a mother was sending her child away. So and a dad sending his child away. In my mind, I'm thinking to myself, well, this is a grievous time in Abraham's life to know that he has got to abandon one of his children. He don't just have to send him away, he's got to cut him off. Because for God's promises to happen in Abraham's life now, he's got to let go of the past. There's people in our lives that it's a good thing for them to walk out and leave. As much as we want to hang on to what we feel like and what we think is so good and so great given us by God, is really things that need to walk out. And when we don't let them walk out, we're still dealing with the same 13 years of animosity we wish would quit. But it's not going to quit until one of them leaves. It's the truth about it. So where we get started here, she has in the last went to her husband Abraham and said, Abraham, thy handmaiden, not my servant. That's where you get thy from. That's where you start going into where did she come from? Why is she calling her his? When she's the woman of the house and they serve her as well, she was given to him, not to her. He should have left Egypt and left her in Egypt. But he picked her up and took her because she obviously had to be pleasing unto his sight. I hate to tell you. Why else do we let people come into our lives or we like what they say, or something? Something draws people to us. Undoubtedly. I hate to say it like that, but if you were just going by the laws of nature in this human flesh, something had to have drawn her to Abraham. It's the way it works. All right, so in verse 11, and that thing very grievous in Abraham's sight because of his son. Ishmael mocked Isaac, and Sarah saw it. At 17-year-old child and a 3-year-old child, you figure a brother would kind of nurture someone that's a quarter of his age, not be mocking what he's doing in this society that we're talking about now. Now, in our society, it's a little different. My older brother's here, so he can contest to the fact that me and him would fight, and my parents wouldn't say anything. But if we touched my baby brother Stephen, it was on. We could beat each other up with pound puppies in the back room all we wanted. But as soon as we touched Stephen, and he started crying, Mama was fit to be tied. And I'm thinking, that's why he's going to grow up and be a wuss if we don't, But that's the way you do, each other as boys. So in my mind, they're just being boys. But one's 17 and one's 3. That chain, there's a huge difference between there. We're all 2 to 3 years apart, given what time of the year we're in. So you would think that he would be nurturing the child because of how young he is, not mocking him. But he's doing what's normal to him. Because what he has seen for this 13 years is his mama mock his father's wife and his father's child, which is to come. So he is acting out what his mama has been imparting into him. Our kids act out hatred and animosity towards other people, and then people ain't got no idea why this kid's mad at them. Yeah, because at home, they've been running you through the ringer. And the kids have heard it for so long, they just pick up on it and keep doing it. So she is seeing a provision, what I feel like was given by God to see what's going to happen if she don't put a stop to it. Because now she's got her promise from God, so now she's keyed in on God. But before, 13 years ago, she was still thinking God's a joke. This is a joke. This is not what's going to happen. There's no way I could give birth to a child, and if I could, how could I feed it? I'm going on, 80-some years old. But now she's keyed in on God and listened to everything. This is my promise. This is what God says is going to inherit everything that's between me and my husband. There's no way that kid's getting half of it or that kid's getting any part of it. Because not only does she start off or finish up last week's lesson with bondwoman shall not be an heir with my son, even with Isaac. There's no way Ishmael is going to get anything that belongs to Isaac in my sight. But that's her stepson, in theory, or half-son, however you want to call it, in our society today. So he is just as right to an heir to what Abraham has as Isaac does. But God's got to separate the carnal side so he can give us the promised side. So carnality has to go so the spirit can increase. Sarah was the one that had the problem this entire time, but if you back up to Genesis 16:3, you'll find out she was all for this plan. Why do our best made plans come out to be havoc in our Christian walk? Because they're ours. Because we're not wrestling with the angel of the Lord, we're just wrestling with us. So what he's been dealing with is bad decisions. Now 13 to 14 years later, we're dealing with the consequences from them bad decisions. I never understood what teaching a child wrong understood until I had my own kids. Because I'm reaping some of the decisions I made when I was a younger parent now. Oh, when they were a baby, I shook them. I wish you could just tell me what you wanted. And then 13 years later, I wish you'd just shut up. I don't care what you want. I'm reaping some of those bad consequences now. I rushed her to talk, and now I wish she'd be quiet. I hope you're going to turn out like your dad, and then I think of now, please be like your mama. It's the reality of this thing. We think that we got it figured out. If they would be like me, they would think like me, they would talk like me, they would act like me. No, there's no way they're going to be just like you. So please be more like your mom. So you have a little, not such a rough life because you can't stop talking. Well, here again is Ishmael's mother despising Sarah in 16:4. A verse later, after Hagar gets what she wants, Sarah gets what they want, they realize this ain't what we wanted. So we work really, really hard and we put up money for later in life, and then when we get later in life, realize this ain't what we really wanted. So we wasted a lifetime doing things in which we wanted to do instead of the things in which God had laid out for us to do. So the funny part about the mocking in which Isaac was having done to him by Ishmael was that it made everybody laugh. So was he playing a joke on his brother? His name means laughter. Ironically, he was making people laugh, but the only one who couldn't see the humor in it was Sarah. She's obviously the one who found something wrong with what was going on. What's funny to other people, when it hurts you, is not so funny to you. We can cut up and play jokes, but if it's offensive to somebody else, it's not so funny to them. So what's funny to us all the time is not funny to somebody else. Paul says specifically in Galatians 4:29 that Ishmael persecuted Isaac. Well, that's a completely different word than mocking. Mocking to us is, he was talking what the Urban Dictionary calls is junk, talking junk to him, playing around, thinking it's funny at his expense. But Paul didn't see it that way. Paul seen it as in he was persecuting his younger brother. Well, he's looking through the eyes of what Sarah's seen, is the persecution in which is to come in the future. What she got to see was early on what was going to happen to Abraham's seed through Isaac when they get to Egypt. See, we're going back to Egypt. He took something from Egypt that should have never came from Egypt, had a child with it, and then he gets put in bondage by the Egyptian. His people does. But he was in bondage by the Egyptians way before then when he decided to have a child with that woman. It was a good idea, but the consequences costing him a whole lot. 13 years of silence from the Lord, we couldn't stand. If the Lord just decided today he wasn't going to talk to us no more, we couldn't stand it. What about the 400 years between Malachi and Matthew? We couldn't fathom God just shutting up heaven and saying, you know what, I'm not going to talk to y'all. And then when he comes back, he brings Jesus on the scene. But those 13 years were probably the roughest years of Abraham's life. It wasn't so much of what he was dealing with in his home. It wasn't so much he was dealing with the bad choices in which he made. It's the fact that God wasn't talking to him. Spend a day inside of your home with your spouse and walk around past each other and don't talk. You know something's wrong. Yeah. And then you're begging them just to talk to you, so let's fight this thing out so we can get past it. Well, that's where Abraham is at this point. Let's do whatever it takes to get past this. And then God shows up on the scene and does this miraculous thing, and then Isaac comes to fruition. And then Isaac starts to get persecuted by the Egyptians because he might be half of Abraham, but he's still half of his mother. Not saying his mom was the bad one. Just saying that what she taught him and what Abraham was teaching him were two different ends of the spectrum because they started to come out. He started to hate the thing in which was taking things from him, so that's why he started doing what he was doing to his brother. I think that's why older brothers are mean to younger brothers. They get all the attention because they're the last one. So we spend more of our time being mean to them to make them into what we are. It's the truth. Then Sarah says from Abraham to remove thy bondwoman and her son. Sarah says, the son of the bondwoman will not be heirs with my son. This thing was so grievous in Abraham's sight, it became the biggest issue and the biggest hurdle he will have to overcome until the crucifixion of his own son. You know, see, he doesn't see what God's going to require of him to do to his own child. He's just seeing what God's requiring of him to do now. But it's coming through his wife, in which, like I said a few minutes ago, if I went to Amanda and said we had to get rid of one of our children, it would cause a fight like no other. It would. Even if it was Kamai that was born of a different mother. But she's ours. It would still be the same. How could you part with something that God has given you? Whether Ishmael was of Hagar, he was still just as much a son of Sarah as he was Hagar's. Because the born son was supposed to come from Sarah. So Sarah probably nurtured this child when he was young. Even though the animosity between her, she still was probably a mother to him. How can you not mother an infant? I don't touch infants because I'm scared I'm going to break them. But you bring a child around Amanda, she'll take it home. How can a mother not nurture a child? So I'm sure Hagar had some feeling of connection until Isaac came. Then she was holding her own. And then I'm sure that Hagar wanted to be a mother to Isaac as well. They were from two different worlds. If you bring someone here from Africa, they're going to want to teach you all about Africa. They're going to want to know all about you. I'm sure the Egyptian woman had things about her homeland that she taught her son that she was going to try to teach Isaac. So there was a whole lot of stuff going on here that behind the scenes that the Bible just doesn't come out and say. But what it does say is it grieved Abraham greatly. He thought he had issues with hanging out with these two for 13 years. Hell, he's got big problems now because he loved his son. And the reason why you know he loved his son, he taught his son about God. He taught his son about God in such a way. Here in a few minutes when we go start talking about his son, God heard his son, but spoke to Hagar. And there's another thing that's laying in the background here. When this first happened and Sarah thought this was a good idea, and Hagar did too, after she conceived, she ran away. Why'd she run away? Sarah was mean to her. But God promised her then promises of her seed because he belonged to Abraham. So while God was not talking to Abraham, he talked to her and told her what was going to happen. So God's quiet to the man of God, but he talks to her. Then God comes back again to talk to Abraham. Then he talks through Sarah to tell Abraham what to do. You listened to her last time. Let's see if you'll listen to her this time. It's the truth. And then God shows up to Abraham and says, Abraham, you need to do what your wife's told you to do because that's what I told her to tell you. That's a hard thing to swallow. God, why don't you just tell me? Then God said unto Abraham, let it not be grievous in thy sight of the lad, and because of thy bondwoman, and all that Sarah has said unto thee, hearken unto her voice, for in Isaac shall be thy seed be called. Man, listen to your wife, because this time she's got it right. I wasn't present last time, but this time she's got it right. Well, you know, there's two different seeds to Abraham and Abraham's lineage. There's an Isaac and there's an Ishmael. All the bad in the world don't come from just one of those children. I know how they like to draw out the little thing and tell you every good thing about him, but if you go into Isaac's seed and you go into Ishmael's seed, there's garbage on both sides. Anywhere Satan can get in, he does. Period. Whether the children are good or bad, they still have issues that they deal with. And if you go through both lineages all the way down, they might say the Antichrist is coming out of Ishmael's, but he just as well could come out of Isaac's. It's the truth about it. There's just as nasty, rotten, wicked people on Isaac's side as there is Ishmael's. But Ishmael's always cast off as the enemy. He's still a seed of Abraham. There's still Abraham's descendants today that came from that side. And whether you like this or not, we probably have 1% of both sides. One way or the other. We're on one tree, and then some of them, the tree doesn't arc anymore because they've came together. The bloodline's still there. And you're like, well, I don't know if we came from there. Well, if you go to Jerusalem today, you'll find Jews from every region because they were so diverse. Well, the ones that scattered to the European side, we came from the European side. So there's descendants out of that came to America in the first place. If you trace George Washington and his descendants back far enough, it'll go back to England. And it'll go back before that and before that. Ancestry.com ain't going to get you but so far. God don't want you to know exactly where you came from. He just wants you to be a child of His now. So what's the big deal? If I'm from this heritage or this heritage, I don't know a whole lot about my family. I know bits and pieces, but it don't matter because I'm adopted into a family now that you are my brothers and sisters now. Not just biologically my brothers and sisters. God knew that we didn't need a girl in our family, so He didn't give us one. So when I got adopted into God's family, He gave me a bunch of sisters because He knew that she probably wouldn't have survived our childhood. It's the reality of it. Ishmael was born for this reason. Isaac was born for this reason. But the reasons are not for us to fully comprehend or grasp. We can't. That's why I love God making it very simple and very clear. Your thoughts are not my thoughts. Your ways are not my ways. I quote that the most because I have to understand I can't think like God. I can't even act like God sometimes because my thoughts get in the way. And my ways are not like His ways all the time. And He didn't give me Jesus as a grace card. He gave me Jesus as something to mimic. So I try to mimic Christ, but for all my shortcomings, Christ is making up for because His perfection. In the midst of the hurting and the disruption of Abraham's heart, God speaks to him and says some things to him that speak echoes because you will find him not saying this to his own son. Christ is in the garden and He's going back and forth with the Lord. We don't know God's side of it. We only understand what the disciples wrote that were present, that give the account for what Jesus said to God. But Jesus was grieving. He was grieving in such a way that his body started to produce blood out of its pores. That's grief, as we see it. But God shows up and speaks to Abraham. And the Bible records it, but it does not record what God said to Jesus. It only shows one side of the conversation. I wonder, because this is where God give us an imagination. If God's having the conversation with him and he just tells him, you're my firstborn son. What I sent Abraham to do with Isaac, I send you to complete. Because we've got to make perfect what sin has made imperfect. So at that time, does he do the exact same thing in which Isaac does? Sure. He just goes and lays down on the altar or the cross. Interesting fact about the cross while I was studying this week. Y'all have any idea when we started worshiping the cross? 250 years after Christ's crucifixion is when the church adopted the cross. 250 years. It's like Jesus going to the gas chamber and we start worshiping the gas chamber. Because the cross was used as a torture tool by the Romans to kill people. And they started putting them all in their synagogues and everything, and they forget the one that was on the cross. But they worship the cross. No, not at all. We just assume this one looks like that because Hollywood made the perception in our minds of what things are supposed to look like. So you have Christ going to make the ultimate sacrifice, and Isaac was just born into the sacrifice because he doesn't understand what he's born into yet because he's been with his mom and his dad, and what he knows is what he probably understands at this time, a servant and his brother. Well, in our day and age, how will we explain that? It's actually quite easy. God intended for you, but this is what I did wrong. He's not what's wrong. My choices are what is wrong. So God's intention and what I did wrong now have to come face to face. God's intention for humanity was to be with him in the garden forever. But because of man and my own plan, now I get to go out in the heat and sweat. I'm going to punch at him in the face. I swear. Every time I get hot, I think about that. I'm going to punch him in the face. Every time when Amanda was having a baby, I said, you need to slap Eve. It's not my fault. When she was pregnant with Caden. So notice the word thy, bondwoman. He automatically, when something's wrong between a man and a woman, they go to talk about whose fault it is. Sarah went to Abraham, thy bondwoman, yours. She was given to you twice. But she doesn't say that. She was given to you by the Egyptian Pharaoh, and then I gave her to you, which means the predicament in which we're in now. Boy, that's hard to swallow. It's hard to swallow going to your spouse and say, you're the reason we're in this, but I made those same bad decisions, but I'm just going to be mad at you for it. I ain't none of y'all married. Okay, we'll just sit there and don't laugh. All right, I'm the only one married in here. I fellowship loudly with my wife sometimes, whether she is right or not. I just have to get my point out so I can be done being mad about it. Okay? So when she says, thy bondwoman, it's your fault. You shouldn't have did this. Even though it was my idea, that wasn't in there either. But if you back up, the Bible records she came to her husband, and then he agreed to it. So they're both dummies in this decision. Who would have ever thought this was a good idea? Well, he probably thought it was a good idea because back then everything was pleasant in their home. Everything's pleasant until you make a bad decision inside of your home, and then it's like chaos, and you're just wanting it to quit. Moses had the same problem. Ends up on Mount Sinai and tells them, you're going to deal with them people or I'm not going back down. I'll just die up here with you. And what does God do? He deals with his people. But he uses Moses to do it. I believe Hagar was given to Abraham when he went to Egypt in Genesis 12 and 16, when he starts to divide up the stuff Pharaoh starts to divide up the stuff to get her to leave. That's the only spot in which he could have ended up with an Egyptian servant. He didn't say that it was a lineage of anybody. It says an Egyptian servant. The only time we have record in the Bible of him being in Egypt is after he left Terah when his father died. Makes sense. Abraham was a very wealthy man. So when he came into the city, he didn't come in the city just looking like any old bum off the street. He came into the city as a wealthy man. People might not have knew him, but they knew what he had on, which showed his wealth. But see, people look past what is important. They didn't see that he was a godly man. They just saw his wife was fair. And she was pretty. And so that kind of gives you the indication that Abraham kind of could have looked like Sarah's father, not her husband, because they didn't connect the two immediately. And I think that is funny because me and Amanda go to churches and they think Amanda's my kid. And I'm thinking, I can't be that old looking for them to think you're my child. And her comment is, you look pretty rough. So, but they've done that more than one occasion. So I told Amanda, hey, you're going to have to age this thing up so people know you're my wife and they don't think Caden's my wife and you're our kid. Because Caden's gotten so big now. But we look past what the obvious is and we see what we want to see. Pharaoh's son, the prince, was obviously looking for a wife or he wouldn't have looked at Sarah like that. Or he was just looking with his own heart and he's seen what he wanted to see. God says for Abraham to obey all Sarah says to do concerning this matter. He don't only tell her, hey, what she said to you is right, but all of what she said to you is right. Because in order for God to do what he's going to do with Isaac, Ishmael's got to go. In order for God to do what he needs to do with Ishmael, Ishmael has to leave. Ishmael's already been taught for 16 to 17 years by Abraham who God is, what God is about, what God will do for you, and the things in which you're supposed to be doing unto the Lord. How do we know this? Because when he made sacrifices, the son was generally there in that culture. Once they were weaned from their mom, they spent all their time with their dad in that culture. So he would have been raised, let's say he's 17, for 14 years, majority of the time by Abraham. How do we know this to be a fact? If you back up to if you fast forward to the Shunammite woman, once her child was weaned, she was in the field with her husband. He was in the field with his dad the entire time. We know that story because he gets sick, and like every good parent, the dad sends the sick child home to mom. Because mom's a little bit more nurturing than the man is. We just tell him, suck it up, keep working, we'll go home when we're done. So he has seen Abraham set these things up before the Lord multiple times. He's probably seen Abraham cry before the Lord. If God was absent from our life for 13 years, we're going to be shedding some tears because we want to know what we did wrong to make this union possible again. And then God tells him, don't do just what she says, but do all of what she says concerning this matter. Not only do you have to send your bondwoman away, but you got to send your son away too. That's hard. Wonder how hard it was for God to send Christ away. We were talking this past week back here about Jesus and the cup and him talking to them about the crushing process between himself as he sits there and he's holding the cup. And he said, this is a symbol of the New Testament, which is in my blood. Well, something has to happen before the grape is ripe, and the grape becomes wine. There's a crushing process that has to happen. And he's talking about himself in three different forms. Where we're talking about the form in which the crushing and the thing in which Christ has never felt in his entire life that he is going to feel for the very first time that was bothering him so bad was the separation from his Father. He knew what that was going to mean. Abraham had experienced separation from his father for 13 years, and now he was having to separate his son from him. So he was grieved from them 13 years he had spent, grieving, wanting God's conversation, and now he's going to have to grieve because he may never have a conversation with his own son again. And here Jesus is talking about this is a covenant, a new covenant, which is in my blood, but the crushing has to happen first. Well, here's the crushing in Abraham's life. This crushing in which he's going through now is going to prepare him for the mountain that he has to go on with Isaac later. The crushing in which we're enduring as the church now is just a pre-step to the kingdom to come. You don't think it's hard to be a Christian in society nowadays? It's harder than it's ever been. Because they have no respect. No one has any respect for a Christian anymore. Because so many people who've called themselves Christians live their lifestyle and just come to church on Sunday. So we've lost our stature in society because we've chose both sides of the fence. We did not choose to let that old carnal side of us go when Christ hung it on the cross and killed it. We still try to mimic the old man too much. So the world sees us as a churchgoer on Sunday and then a world liver on Monday. All through the week, and then we come back on Sunday. We're good. The hard part is when I stand before God, is He going to say, hey, you never circumcised that old man that I told you to do. You were supposed to do it here, and you continued your entire life like that. That's going to be a hard scene. Is when I stand not only before the people in this church, my family, but God. I can be judged on this side of eternity by my family and by the church. I'm scared to death when I stand before the Lord for things that I've done knowingly and things I haven't done or things I have done that not knowingly. Or teach something that I didn't listen to Him well enough. And when He tells Abraham, don't only do what she said with the bondwoman, but you send your child away too. So He said all of what she told you to do. That's hard. Because if He don't, there's consequences for His disobedience. For a customs standpoint during this time, once a husband releases or frees the second wife, the bondwoman, she is now free, no longer a slave or a servant, so she can't be sold as a slave or a servant under anybody else. But her son is no longer an heir. All focus is now on the promise and not her son. Now Isaac gets all the focus. All the servants, all the materialistic stuff that Abraham has. When Abraham dies, Isaac gets it all. But let me show you something in this that I see happening now. She just became a single mom of a 17-year-old child with no dad around. There's a whole lot of things here that's going to go wrong. Certain things in a young man's life he needs to learn from his father. In my case, my dad used to tell us, if you're going to do things once, do it right the first time so you don't have to do them twice. He used to drive us insane when we were kids. Then as I got older, he says, you always have a plan. No matter what decision you make, you always have a plan. And third is always think about the things in which you're doing before you do it so you don't have any regrets at the end. Make the best educated decision based upon the information in which you have at the time. He used to drive me insane as a child. But my mom was the exact opposite. Oh, well. But you see the two different lifestyles that they led. My mom's, oh, well, my dad had 3 morals until he got saved, and then he adopted God's morals. But my mom's still living by the same thing. Oh, well. When I come before the Lord, I hope my answer is not, oh, well. And I've told her that before too. But she was a single mom majority of our childhood. My parents divorced when I was 5 years old, and she was a single mom most of my childhood. But there was things I needed from my dad's insight that she could not give me as a young man. Now, my work ethic, both my parents worked really, really hard, so we got work ethic from both sides. But my mom could not teach me how to be a man because she was a woman. Ishmael started picking up traits of his mom the more it went on. He was raised by Abraham. Abraham instilled some things into him in the beginning that you're going to see him use when they're wandering around in the wilderness for no reason. But his mom reverted back to what she was instead of who she had become as Abraham's wife. When the divorce happened, she went straight back to doing the things in which she was doing before. You want to know how the Bible proves that? When she went to take a wife for her son, she went straight to Egypt. She didn't want no part of what Abraham was and Abraham's God was, even though Abraham's God is the one that provided for her. She went straight back to what she knew before. We will revert back. We get out of church for any amount of season, you wait until you see what your life starts to look like. The old person. the first thing to go is your mouth. You want to know why? Because that's the easiest place for the enemy to infiltrate is the mouth. And that's the first place that you will see yourself start slipping. It's not in your biblical studies. It's when you're having a conversation with somebody else is where Satan gets in the most. Well, she becomes a single mom all at one time. So she does the best in which she can. But if you back up and you find the story in Genesis chapter number 17, you'll find the promises in which God gave Ishmael's mom Hagar about him and what God was going to promise to him if she went back and done the things in which she was supposed to do. First, you're going to find he tells Hagar, I will bless him. There's no greater blessing in which you can get from a person than God saying, I will bless them. You ain't got to worry about taking care of them. I'm just going to show up and they're going to be all mine. And we know that God can do this because Jesus lived for 33 and a half years. God blessed his son. You know, I often said before he was a carpenter, I would love to find a piece of furniture in which he designed because it's flawless. It's still hanging out around here somewhere untouched. We still can't find it. We've been looking forever. It's called the Ark of the Covenant. Everybody's looking for it because his blood's applied to the mercy seat on that covenant between God and man. So, God says, I have blessed him. I will make him fruitful. Means he will be more than where he come from. You want to know why? It's because who his daddy is. Our kids are sowing seeds because of who their dad and who their mom is today. Not because good and bad. Not just because of the decisions in which they're making, just because you are the person in which God intended you to be now. God is blessing your children because of that. And you're like, well, that's good and bad. Well, the bad side of it comes from the decisions in which they're making. They still have to reap the consequences. But it does not mean that the blessings in which God has put on their life, they cannot still reap. And they didn't even have to sow it. Ishmael's getting sown seed just because Abraham. God's promises have not changed since the beginning of time for his people. And they're never going to change. Then he says, I will multiply him exceedingly. Most households today are 2 to 3, sometimes 4 family households, okay? You have a couple kids and then you stop. That's not what God said. God said, I'm going to give him something that he can't even imagine. Exceedingly to God, what does that measure? We can't even understand what one is in God's perspective. We can't even really calculate one day in God's perspective because he's infinite. But he said, I'm going to do it exceedingly. Then he says, he shall beget 12 princes. Well, princes have to be heir to something to be a prince. So down his lineage, I'm going to make him a king. Then I'm going to give him 12 princes. Then he tells him, I will make him a great nation. God's reason for blessing Ishmael is because he is Abraham's son alone. The benefits in which some of our kids are reaping today is just because they belong to us. Wow. What have I ever done good enough for God to bless my child? Fathoms me. But just because Ishmael is Abraham's son, God said, I'm going to give him just as much as I promised you, Abraham. And I'm just going to give it to him because I promised you. Because he said, thy seed. He didn't tell him, why didn't he say just Isaac? Because he wanted Abraham to know, because you're mine, I'm going to bless everything that comes to you or comes from you. Wow. And also, for Isaac, thy seed to be called, I will make him a nation. I'm not just going to give him little portions. I'm not going to do all this other stuff. I'm going to give him many nations. The references to the Ishmael's 12 sons is Genesis 25, 12 through 18, and then 12 princes is Genesis 17 through 20. And Abraham rose up early in the morning. Now we get to the morning in which Abraham has got to do the deed. Well, this is the first of his two major crushing points in his life. He has to send his oldest son away. And he raises up early. I wonder if he could sleep all night. I can't sleep all night when I know I'm going on vacation the next day. And when I was a child, I couldn't sleep all night when I knew Christmas morning was the next day. But I wonder if he was up all night agonizing with God, is there any other way? We see Jesus in the garden agonizing with God, let the cup pass from me. So is Abraham, being the father of many nations, a representation of Christ in the garden, is he up all night saying, God, is there any other way that we can make this happen? No. Because in order for you to be my child and be in your direct order of obedience to me, you got to let some things go. Letting things go are the hardest thing to do when you think that they're an achievement of yours. Right. Everything we have today is because God blessed us with it. No matter how hard we worked for it and think we earned it, it's still a blessing of God. Try to do it without His breath. It can't happen. Everything that we have that we think that we achieve still is a blessing of God. It's not to be earned. It's to be given by the Lord. The sweat of the brow came because of Adam, not because of God. You got to put it in perspective too. So he's having to raise up the next morning and do something that he never thought when this plan transpired that he would have to do, and that's to give up. If I seen Abraham as anything, is not a man who gives up. He just does whatever he has to do to make it work. Even though I made a bad decision, I'm having to deal with it. So he just wants to deal with the situation at hand instead of having to do this thing in which now not only his wife's telling him to do, but God's telling him to do. And he took bread and a bottle of water and gave it unto Hagar, putting it on her shoulder and the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Bersezda. Okay. Well, there's another reason why he rose up early and got them up early. Any of you guys know anything about wells? Okay. In Bible time, wells were about a day's journey away from where you were going. Every direction in which you went, there were wells. The reason why there were wells was a symbol from God that there's good signs of life. So he rose up that morning so that they would get there in plenty of time. Hagar had ran away from Abraham before. And where did God find her? At a well. So when she leaves this time, why is she wandering around in the wilderness? She knows where the well's at. Because sometimes we cannot bring forth new life where the well is when we're still trying to figure out how we got done wrong in the old way. She can't get her mind off of what's happening to her and on to the focus and what she needs to be looking for, which is new life. Because she's still hanging on to what she was. Because for 13 to 17 years now, she has been a second wife to a very wealthy man and a very wealthy, godly man. Now she finds herself a single mom with a 17-year-old man walking around trying to find a new life. But we cannot let God bring new life into our life when we're still holding on to the old ways and not moving forward. So what she's doing is she got up early because her husband had obviously got her up that morning, let her know this is what was going to happen. She was probably anxious all night too. What am I going to do? How am I going to do this? All these things invade your mind when something tragic happens all of a sudden. Could I have done something different? Would I have made a better call? Would I have had someone else help me make this decision? Would I have counseled with God a little longer before this came? She was probably having all these problems. What if I'd have never said yes to go with him? I wouldn't be in this predicament. Well, you can't do nothing about what could have been. You can only do about what we have to do now. So many people get stuck in the past. That's why their future never comes. That's why we have so many people addicted. That's why we have so many people taking their own lives. They cannot get past the past and move to the future in which God has for them. And every future is bright because it's out of where you're at. Even the darkest ones are still brighter than where you're at. So you got to keep moving. You got to keep focused on what God's trying to bring forth in your life that you just won't let happen. And it's a hard thing to do. It's just to let it go. Matter of fact, they made an entire movie about it. Every child in this church knows how to sing this song. I know every word to that song and every word to the movie because we watched it so much. Because God's trying to tell us something. Hey, man, we need to let this thing go so we can move forward. So he rose up early and he took bread. I'm not talking about a loaf of bread, Sara Lee preferably. Whole wheat honey, that's the good one. I'm not talking about him giving her a loaf of bread and sending her on her way. During this time and age, he would have prepared meals for that day until they got to somewhere in which they had to go. That's what you did. When you took a journey, you would prepare the meal, but they always called it bread. So it was more than likely more than just bread because she could have carried bread in her hand. Why did he put it on her shoulder? Because he probably prepared enough for her and the child for more than just a day. I'm having to send these two out the rest of my life. They need to know how to do things, how to take care of themselves, and they need provision before they get there. So he had provided things for them to go. And he probably provided enough water for more than just a day's journey. Because rising up in the morning was an urgent thing for them to do so they could get to where they were going before nightfall. She had been to a well before, and yet she can't find her way back because God had no intent on her for going the same direction. So when Abraham sent her, he sent her the other direction because he knew what direction she had came back from the first time. Because when she ran away with his child, he probably sat like the prodigal son's father did and waited for her to return because he didn't know where she went. But he knew what direction she had come back from, and he knew not to send her that direction again because that would have not been God's will to go back to what you came from. It's always to keep going forward. All right, I'm going to skip a couple things real quick. Verse 17, and God heard the voice of the lad, and the angel of God called to Hagar out of heaven. Well, if you look at it and you're studying it out, it tells you that Hagar at this time is sitting a bow shot off. If you look it up, it doesn't give you a whole lot of anything to go off of what a bow shot off is. But if I shoot a bow and arrow, depending on the direction in which I shoot, it'll depend on how far it goes. So it was far enough that she didn't have to see her son die in the direction in which he was in. But here she is pleading and agonizing with God, and God hears her son. God hears her son because her son knew how to get a hold of him. All the time in which she has spent as Abraham's secondary wife, she had never paid enough attention on how to get a hold of God, but her son did. I would rather hear what her son's saying to God than her. I want to know what the guy who understood how to get a hold of God and understood the conversation between his father and God, and I would like to know what he's talking about. Because she has already forgotten her promise. Not only did God promise Abraham and Sarah Isaac, but God had a list of promises for Ishmael. And here she is wandering around in a place she ain't got no business being in. All she had to do was keep going, and she would have found what she was looking for. But here she is agonizing with God, just giving up. I'm just going to die here and let him die over there so I ain't got to watch it. Forgetting totally about the promises of God. She never even brings them up when she's talking to him. She's forgotten about them. A lot of days, the only thing I can hang on to is the promises of God in my life. And here she is just giving up the promises of God because it's getting a little too hard. I'm sure it's hot in the middle of the desert. It's hot in North Carolina. But God, this woman is giving all she's got to the Lord, and God hears her son. Because sometimes God's got to talk to the promise to get you to remember the promise. So as he's talking to him, he goes over there and he sends the angel of the Lord, which in my notes say the incarnate Christ, starts to interact with Hagar and tells Hagar, the first thing he starts to say, do you not remember? Was it such a long time ago, do you not remember what I told you? I will never leave you nor forsake you. Your son's going to get all this whenever he is older. All you have to do is just keep moving. Heaven is my eternal home if I am a child of the Lord Jesus Christ. All I have to do is keep moving and keep going and pressing forward to finish my race. And sometimes just remembering the promises of God, not focus on my current condition. He tells her a specific thing to do. Arise, lift up the lad. I actually put lab there. Go pick up your dog. Arise, lift up the lad, and hold him in thy hand, for I will make him a great nation. So God starts to immediately tell her, I heard your son. Now go pick him up. Because at this time, he's probably too weak to even hold himself. He said to hold him in your hand. I don't know how many of you moms in here can hold a 17-year-old child. Exactly. So hold him in your hand, and I'm going to start speaking things over his life. Basically, Mom, you've separated yourself. You've gotten out of the way. Now I can start working. So God says, I will make him a great nation, but you're going to have to put some work into it. What do you mean work? You're going to have to go put your hands on him. You're going to have to go pick him up. You're going to have to help him out. Then he does the miraculous. He shows her where the well's at. She can see the well from where she's standing, where she lays her child to die. What sense does that make? If I'm about to die, I'm looking everywhere possible for something to drink. And she did not see it at all. Because the life in which was coming forth out of her life next, God did not let her see until she was at a specific state that he could show her the things in which was to come. Because she had forgotten. How many of us have forgotten the promises in which God has made to us in our life? And we're just wandering around waiting to die. You know what? If we're a child of God, we're a well to a lost and dying world. They've just been laying there long enough to die. And then you come by. So this morning, don't forget those promises of God in your life that you could be a well of water to someone who's in need during this day. It might even be the person sitting next to you that you share a home with. And some days it's the person in which you share a bed with. Some days I need her to feed me, and some days she needs me to feed her. Because God put us together for a reason. Amen?